My name is Raymond Crave. I'm in the Department of History and also the current director of the Latin American Studies program. So thanks for coming out for this event. This is our inaugural, which means we hope that it will continue into the future, distinguished lecture series in the Latin American Studies program. And we're really, really delighted today to welcome Professor Charles Walker. Professor Walker is a professor of history at the University of California, Davis. He is the director of the Hemispheric Institute of the Americas, and also currently holds the MacArthur Foundation Endowed Chair in International Human Rights. I just want to say a few things about Chuck's work, about Professor Walker's work. He's written numerous books, some of them ones you may be familiar with: Smoldering Ashes, Cusco and the Creation of a Republic in Peru, 1780 to 1840. That came out in 1999. It's been published and translated into French and Spanish. Shaky Colonialism, the 1746 earthquake tsunami in Lima, Peru, and its long aftermath. Came out in 2008, translated into Spanish also. More recently, the Tupac Amaru Rebellion came out in 2014. A narrative, but also very richly analytical history of the Tupac Amaru Rebellion that also nicely situates it in the era of the kind of Atlantic Revolutions literature as well, and was one of the best books of the year by the Financial Times. That had it as one of their best books of the year, and it's also came out in Spanish last year. He's also co-edited an English language edition of Alberto Flores Galindo's classic In Search of an Inca, Identity and Utopia in the Andes. He's published in Peru, Diálogos con el Perú, Ensayos de Historia in 2009. And I should add, hot off the presses, The Lima Reader, which he co-edited with Carlos Aguirre and is part of Duke University Press's reader series, so cities and country reader series, a sort of intellectual the sort of intellectual traveler's tome, right? Something beyond the Lonely Planet Guide. And lastly, I'll just say very quickly, he's also much more than the sum of his books, even though they are, in fact, great books, and I recommend them to you. It's also important just to keep in mind that Professor Walker is a really central figure in Latin American history and Latin American historiography in the United States today. He's trained a generation of students who are now populating the halls of universities and colleges around the country and continues to do so. He's been deeply involved in the profession and has given extensively to the profession in a wide variety of ways. So I can think of no better way than to welcome Chuck Walker for our inaugural Latin American Studies program lecture. Thanks.
Well, I want to thank everyone for attending, and I want to thank Ray for that very gracious introduction. I blushed. And I also want to thank Bill who's here, who's doing all the work. It's been a wonderful visit. As the director of a center, I know how much work these are and how much fun it is and how much there is to it. And I've also enjoyed meeting graduate students. When I was asked, I said, I'm surprised I've never been to Ithaca. I have undergrad students who have come to study here. One of them is here present. I've had graduate students come here on postdocs. I have family contacts. My sister-in-law brother teaches here and things like that. And there's also very important Davis and Ithaca contacts. I know that Davis Cornell, there's a competition which has the best vet school. My neighbor who's in the vet school said to make sure that I mentioned the fact that Davis just got #1 in the rankings or some silly thing like that. And there's also Peru Cornell with Vicos and these other projects. So anyway, I'm delighted to be here. What I want to do today is, it's a new project. I have worked as, all of those books mentioned had in common Peru in pretty much 18th and 19th century. The Lima Reader gets me in the 21st century. My deeply researched historical monographs have really gone from 1750 to 1850. And this is a very new project on the Shining Path. It's preliminary. So in many ways, this is one of those talks where I will benefit more than you might benefit and from questions, queries, and I'm happy to open up the questions. What I want to do is give an overview of the Shining Path. I was telling Ray the biggest mistake speakers give is, we call it courseism. You all know this, and I go to a talk about some other part of the world I don't know much about, and I don't remember the names, or I don't know the chronology. So I know there's some Peruanos here, some people who work on this. This might be a little basic. I'll try to make it sort of short and sweet, a very general overview. Then I decided to add some pictures of the Yuyanapac photo exhibit of the CVR, is the Comisión de Verdad y Reconciliación, the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just to give you some images of this. Some of them are mildly disturbing. There's not a lot of blood, but they're just to give you an impact of things I'm going to talk about, so I don't convert it into a social scientific or historiographic problem. And then I want to turn and make sure at the end that I can really focus on reflections on violence. This is the first part of the project I've been working on. I've done now 3 research trips to Peru. I'm reading in-depth testimonies and looking at this question of why it was so incredibly violent, how we overlooked tens of thousands of people. I'll give away a punchline, but when the war basically ended, the conflict ended, and the Peruvian Truth Commission started, everyone believed, and I taught this, I went and looked at an old lecture to confirm this, and I'm not making that up, 25 to 30,000 dead. The Peruvian Truth Commission found that there were 70,000 dead, 69,600 and something or other. 70,000 rather than 30,000. This is 40,000 people that were unaccounted for. This is one of the sort of problems we'll talk about. How could this have been? What does this say about Peru, about remembering, forgetting, reconciliation, a lot of issues. So at the end, I'll give you some of my initial findings. Some of them, there are preliminary, some of them are not at all controversial, not that surprising, but at least I think it'll prompt a dialogue. So again, I will begin with some background, and again, I know we have some Peruanos here, we have some experts, but others who aren't so much. So geographically, and this should have been a topographic map, the absolute center was Ayacucho of this region. And I'm going to go in the end sort of towards, I'm going to give you 2 chronologies, but there's a pretty simple expansion from Ayacucho out in the Andes to the coast, southern Peru, and into this area, which is the drug area, if you will. Coca is produced that is then converted into cocaine. Again, it should have been topographic because that core area is Andean, and most of that area is 3,000 to 4,000 feet above sea level, or meters. Right here, all of this, right here. Again.
Is there a rainforest?
Yeah, they're all, I mean, to simplify, but it really works. Amazon, this is the Amazon, mountains, and a dry desert. So, I mean, again, there's Peruvians learn in school, my kids when they went to school there, 3 regions, et cetera. And it's, you know, it's not perfect, but it works pretty well. So again, you know, the Shining Path emerged out of the Peruvian left, the classic Soviet-China split, and their Maoist versus Leninist. This was the split between Maoist versus Leninist. And I always, when I'm teaching undergrads in the United States, who often assume that every bit of the world is divided, and you have 2 parties, these 2 very mediocre parties we have, and they split, et cetera, et cetera. And I explain, no, in a lot of the world you have 12 parties or 14 parties or 6 parties. There's nothing that says it has to be 2. But within the split of the left, you have the 64 split, the Maoist versus Leninist, and you get this alphabet soup of the Peruvian left. I don't mean to belittle these at all, but again, there are more than a dozen parties, PC, and then there are a lot of derivations from that. Sendero Luminoso, when I used to do a flow chart of this, or a kinship chart, would be the far left of the Maoist. One thing we'll talk about, there's a totalitarian absolutist belief. There is no need to negotiate with the state. We need to we need to rebuild, destroy and rebuild. A quick, what is Maoism? Mao, the leader of the Chinese Revolution, People's War based in the peasantry, from the countryside to cities. And Abimael Guzman, who I'll talk about in a minute, Presidente Gonzalo, the leader, believed that he was, if you will, a second wave of Maoism, that he, before Nepal, before India, was going to lead a world revolution from Peru, building on and improving on Mao's model. He, Guzman, who I'll talk about in a minute, and many of the leaders had visited China during the Cultural Revolution, and they came back. And right now we're reading some rather horrific stories of China, of the Cultural Revolution. There are a series of books quite negative about them. They came back impressed, accelerating change, getting rid of all remnants of the bourgeois state, all these things that we now generally talk about in horror that people in China do not talk about. In fact, when it's taught in the United States classes, many Chinese students, I'm told by my colleagues, are very uncomfortable with these issues. But for these young revolutionary Maoists, this was the path to continue. And curiously, they came back just as things are changing in China, and much of their rhetoric was against the changes in China. So one of their first acts, and I had a picture, and for time's sake, was hanging a dog talking about the terrible Chinese revisionists who were overturning the Cultural Revolution. And 0.1% of Peruvians could recognize the name of the Chinese leader. This is just, again, it would be like if there was something out here on the flagpole referring to Lithuanian politics. I mean, again, it's just this otherworldly element of it, but very rooted in this vision of Mao and that the Chinese had lost the path. They actually at one point bombed the Chinese embassy because of its revisionist giving up on the revolution.
Who did? Who bombed it?
The Shining Path did. So let me give you some of these traits, and I'll come back to some of these points because these will come back to the violence issues. One of the things that is, every analyst agrees with is they were hardliners. That's sort of a weak journalistic term, but by this I mean everything needed to be destroyed to create the revolution. If you look at Guzman's writings, and he wrote quite a bit, he gave speeches that were followed and venerated by the Shining Path, lots of metaphors about capitalism or semi-feudalism. They had all the debates about what stage of capitalism they were in, has eroded, ruined Peru. The only way to rebuild it is to get rid of all of it. And what this did is it justified a mass violence that wasn't violence against the state, multinational corporations, the elite. It was also against NGOs, non-government organization, cooperative movements, leaders, hundreds of union leaders were killed by the Shining Path. Their violence, in a sense, they set up a dichotomy. If you are not with us, you are part of the old order and thus deserve death. And this is how they justified killing people that was absolutely unthinkable in the rest of the Latin America. Or if they'd been killed, it would have been by US-supported military regimes. So these are leftist guerrillas executing progressive leaders in shanty towns, unionists, and politicians of all the different parties. And I'll come back to this ideology and why it's so important, but why it can be oversimplified. Again, I've already talked about geography, Huamanga or Ayacucho. They were very strong in the regional university there, and as a series of scholars have shown very intelligently, they were very strong in the education program. So as they were building, they weren't underground yet. They were literally in the hundreds, low hundreds, in the late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s, in the education department they recruited. And this is ideal for a Maoist revolution because if you're in a regional university studying, getting a teaching degree, your first job is going to be out in the countryside. Many of these students were bilingual. They spoke Spanish and Quechua. They were sent out in these poor communities, and teachers have an amazing amount of power and autonomy in these areas. I believe my wife's an anthropologist. We lived in these areas. The teacher is often the voice of authorities. It's often the only authority. Went out to these areas and said, you're poor, people in Lima are rich, imperialists are exploiting you, you should be paid more. Almost all of that was very true. You need to follow revolution. I'm simplifying here, but this level of expansion has proven to be very, very true. There's now people trying to map this out of what towns they were and whether these towns tended to be more pro-Shining Path or not. So they were very important in this regional university. They also, and I'll talk more about this, extreme use of violence. They didn't step back. They used violence symbolically, but also in instrumental ways, both to show their power, to magnify their power, and to silence anyone who might criticize them. And in another trait, women were very important from top to bottom. And this is something, the leadership was based in Guzman, I'm going to talk about, but among their fighters, among all levels, women, I wouldn't say an equal role, but a higher percentage than almost any institution in Peru. 40%, 60%, depending on what. Often used to transport arms because the army was very lax about checking women or embarrassed to do them. They wouldn't pat them down, whereas they would for men. They also brilliantly, and again, I say that not complimenting Shining Path, but just complimenting their tactics, if you will. They used middle-class women, whiter women, to take in their suitcases arms because they tended not to be harassed because the military thought it was a lower class or an indigenous movement. So these are some of the elements. Some of these we'll come back to. Now, their tactics were, in some ways, they built off and moved away from that of the classic sort of Che Guevara post-Cuban Revolution guerrillas. For example, they were in small cells. They didn't know each other. This had the great advantage if someone was writing on the wall their sort of pintas or their graffiti, or was throwing a Molotov cocktail, detained by the military, he or she didn't know other names, maybe 2 or 3 people. In the old days of the left in the Southern Cone, if you detained somebody, he or she might know 70 people. And just their address book, in their case of it, and they'd be in their front pocket, you could break up, much of the movement. This was not the case with the Shining Path. They used dynamite, this is just an example, for electric pylons. They did not receive any international support. A little bit maybe from small groups, but minimal. They had a lack of arms, but in a country like Peru, where is dynamite available? Mines. They would take over these small, somewhat rustic mines, enter at night, 60 people armed, and often kill the owner, burn it down, redistribute some wealth maybe, and then take the dynamite, which then wrapped around electric pylons in a country so dependent on hydroelectrics, this would force blackouts in the cities. Again, these were small, relatively easy acts to do that shook the country and did incredible economic sabotage. And again, as I've said, they had the ideology of, if you're not with us, you're against us. And their targets it was just unthinkably broad. And this is the contrast with, if you know a little about the Sandinistas, if you know about the Cuban Revolution, if you know about the MIR in Chile. I mean, these are very different examples I've given. I could give more, but it was almost unthinkable that they would kill union leaders, community spokesmen, members of other leftist parties, etc. For the Shining Path, because this ideology, if you're not with us, you're part of the old order. This allowed this incredible level of violence that every study in recent years, now that people are disaggregating, going through testimonies and putting together the numbers, the picture is getting worse and worse and worse about this. The number of community activists especially is astonishing. So their leader, painted here in a sort of Clark Kent, square-jawed. When I do this, I have to go away because we could just spend I could spend half an hour looking at their posters and such, and time would be over and I wouldn't have said anything, but we'd have some fun. But these are classic sort of Maoist posters, although a lot of Soviet friends, art historian friends in Lima said there's a lot of, Soviet realism, people with much larger art, very strong and things like that. But in all of their posters, you have Abelma Guzman, should be an accent there, is prominent. He is their leader, the absolute epicenter, if you will, of the movement. He is seen as the brilliant leader of it. As I'll say, he calls himself La Cuarta Espada, the fourth sword of Marxism. It's Marx, Lenin, Mao, and Guzman. And again, this was believed by the people, and I think, you didn't hear that much out of Peru, though, those four being put together. But his presence was absolutely central, and I'll get back to why this is important in the defeat of the Shining Path. Who was he? He was middle class, not indigenous, probably really upper middle class from Arequipa. He was a philosophy professor at that regional university in Ayacucho. He had developed what's called the Pensamiento Gonzalo thought, which was seen as this incredible contribution to world Marxism. If you read about it, it's sort of half-baked cliches. There's some interesting points. I mean, I don't want to belittle it, but even people sympathetic have trouble raising it to the level of the work of Mao, Lenin, and Marx, theoretically or even in practice. I mean, I don't want to make him, and I'll talk why, I don't want to make him sound like a buffoon or something, but there were lots and lots of cliches about if something's broken, you've got to rebuild, and there were lots of insults. And he had been trained in the infighting of the left, where the biggest enemy of the Maoists were the Leninists, they called each other revisionists and this and that. The fourth sort of Marxism. He is currently in prison today in Callao. So let me give you a little chronology, and I'll come back to this. This is just, again, the 1980, there was a return to democracy in Peru. It's a great time for an uprising because the military had been in power for 12 years. Very unusual military regime for much of it in Peru. That's a separate issue. There was a weariness with the military, and some of the first actions of Sendero are burning ballot boxes in these little towns in the Andes, saying elections are just a way for the bourgeoisie to pull the wool over your eyes. They mean nothing. It's not going to change, etc. So there's a great deal of violence around the election in 1980. Most of it, and I was living in Lima then, was seen as these odd incidents in the Andes up there, these weird things. And we'll talk a lot about this is the explanation of how a country could overlook 30, 40,000 people dying. Peruvian state takes a while to react, and what they finally do is they send the military, not trained for this at all. They're trained for battle, a war they thought was coming with Chile. They're open field in the ocean. Instead, they're fighting a guerrilla war, fish in the water, the Maoist line up in the Andes. And what they did was commit horrific human rights abuses. Anyone considered a possible Senderista was jailed. The numbers, I don't want to give you a number because I'm not sure, but it's clear the majority tortured, i.e. if you were detained for being a Senderista, you would expect some sort of torture. The number of women raped Senderistas or accused of being a Shining Path member run into the thousands. Again, these are controversial figures in Peru, but I think that's a safe thing to say. Horrific abuses that, again, didn't really inflict that much damage because they would grab someone at the lower level, found maybe on a list, they would track her down. They didn't get much information from her. They would stop her, and then you had the really horrific abuses of towns that had supposedly, Andean towns, because again, the war is taking place in this Quechua-speaking indigenous areas, towns that were forced to allow the Shining Path to be there for a week. They had no alternative. The Shining Path would often come in, commit a ritual murder, often by bashing in the heads of the local mayor, or the local loan shark, or someone who was considered promiscuous, or an SOB. They would bring him in, have a popular trial in front of everyone, generally horrified. Some people may be happy or content with the result. Kill this person, stay a few days. The military would come in. Again, the distances are enormous. The mobility is very hard. The Shining Path would come out, and the military, particularly after about a year, would say, you put up with these people. And the people would say, first of all, the military often didn't have Quechua speakers. They grabbed their soldiers and say, what is she saying? She would say, we're not supporting Shining Path. This is when you start getting the massacres. The military is at night saying, this is BS. These people are supporting them. They're liars. There were cases where they would go into town and people would say, no, we don't support them. They'd find literature, and you start getting massacres. And I'm not going to, had that in the chronology and cut it out. Lucanamarca is one of the famous one, where the military, a bit like El Salvador and some of the horrors of Central America, executing dozens of people. At the same time, you're also getting Sendero coming back and saying, you allow the military in here. What are you doing? Bring in all the people and executing. So both sides are committing mass abuses, both at the individual level, at detaining individuals or groups, and then town by town saying, you supported the other side. And it's a classic case of the indigenous people, the local people be caught literally in the middle. They can't leave. They do leave eventually. We'll talk about the mass migration of Lima. It's very hard for them, particularly in harvest season. These are the poorest of the poor, tied to the land, areas where they've lived for a very long time, with no real alternative, being picked on by both sides. And both sides are abducting children. I mean, the level of horrors, we'll get to the examples, we can certainly talk more about that. By the late 1980s, Shining Path extended into Lima. There was a certain, again, I was living in Lima and Cusco in those years, there was a belief that, my God, these people could win, or there could be just an extensive stalemate. They are belittling the state, they're outrunning the state, they're more creative, et cetera, real fear. And then in September of '92, Abimel Guzman was captured in a posh neighborhood in Lima in a house rented by a ballet dancer. The journalists loved this because she was a very upper middle class Limeña, very tall white ballet dancer. So there's all this, the Maoist professor, the ballet dancer, and you had sort of cheap journalism 101. That at that point, there was a belief that there were about 25,000 dead. Now, there's an incredible parable here about human rights. This is something that's not the focus of the talk, and certainly you could probably figure out I've spoken about before and I teach, is that Guzman was captured. There he is. I just threw that one in because it was I like the roughness of the picture. They burst into the house. The detective work had been amazing. I mean, this really is, in a paper I said, Hollywood-esque. What they did is when they would let Shining Path prisoners, bigwigs out, either because they didn't have enough proof in Lima or they had been in jail 5 to 7 years, they would track them. Well, every self-respecting guerrilla expected this, so what you did is you went to your house, you lay low for 10 days, and if you were going to go out to see Guzman, you would take multiple buses. And again, it's like an old detective story, if you will. Multiple buses, change taxis, go around the block, make sure you're not being followed. But one prisoner, who now the Shining Path blames, was not cautious, got out of jail, supposedly went home, went to a house, showered, ate, took a nap, and went almost straight to his house. She got off like 3 blocks before and like looked on her shoulder. And again, this is like a cheap detective novel, I know. But I've read this, I've actually interviewed one of the policemen who's done this. They tracked her down to the house, but they had a near miss before, so they knew he was in there, but they waited a couple of weeks. They set up couples kissing for the intelligence service to monitor it. The woman who did this, her nickname, proving they're good, was Dry Lips, because she was there making out all day with this other guy while looking at the house and such. They went through his trash to see, they knew what kind of cigarettes he smoked and what kind of medicine he was taking, things like that. And they finally realized he was there. They'd almost capture him. They burst in and capture him on September 12th, 1992. And why I said the human rights parable is killing people, torturing people, these horrible acts, which weren't just done to get information. They were also done because of frustration. They were done it was just gender violence. There was certainly race involved, et cetera, didn't get anywhere. It was detective work following the lay of the land, the rules, the Peruvian Constitution, that broke the Shining Path. Once he was arrested, basically fell apart. I mean, there are small groups today in some of the drug areas. There was one group the continuation group, but once you got the head of it, it was defeated. So this is the quick chronology. So what I'll do now is I'm going to show you some pictures just to get some ideas. And again, these are disturbing. There's nothing, I'll warn you, and if you faint very easily, but there's some bodies, but there's no flowing blood and things like that. But again, I want to humanize this, if you will. These are all from the Peruvian Truth Commission, Yuyanapac, this wonderful photo exhibit that Davis was fortunate to host about 8 years ago and is now in the National Museum in Lima, which the right wing very much wants to close down. So this was after a Shining Path murder. This is a woman coming back I thought it was a husband, but it was a brother, already dressed in black, expecting this town, the Sendero, would come in and killed them for supposedly having supported the military. This is a boy. This is a soldier boy fighting for the Peruvian military. This is out towards the jungle area, and he has just got the communist flag down. I love it because he probably didn't know what the flag meant. It gives you an idea of the preparation of the Peruvian military, as you will. This is a very heartbreaking picture. It's used in a lot of the studies. She's a grandmother looking for her grandson and found her husband at the morgue who'd been killed by the military, supposedly in a mistaken identity. There's some controversy about this picture, about exactly who she is. And I know that I'm showing these people quickly, and I know all of these people deserve their own biography and such, but for time, I won't be able to do this. This is after one of the early bombings of a municipality in a very small town in the Andes. Shining Path had blown up a building, and that's the picture of Presidente Belunde, which was posted in this town. And again, if you go in these small Andean towns, there's often one municipal office. That's the state, and that was blown up with 5 sticks of dynamite or whatever it was, rebuilding there. This is a scene that if you were from the Andes would have filled you with horror. This is a military truck stopping a truckload of market women. We know these are women going to the market. That's a pickup truck with probably 30 people in it. And they detain these people. I think that's the driver. And if you didn't have your documents, this was seen as a shine. You were the member of the Shining Path. Well, there's thousands or hundreds of horrible cases of people left it at home. The cases of, like any conflict, somebody ran out to get bread, didn't bring it, and this or that. Or a lot of indigenous people don't have documents. Peruvian state is not extended, it's expensive, they don't have the picture. And if you were seen as looking like a senderista, you could be taken by the military and god-awful things were going to happen to you. This is not, you were there, very much hoping you weren't on the list or you weren't going to be detained. This is a picture of the San Marcos University, the oldest university in the Americas, founded before Harvard. They always like to say that, they love that there, in which the Shining Path had a very strong presence. I had a gig, I did one article for the Chronicle of Higher Education when I was desperate for money as a grad student, and I had a photographer. He didn't take this one from me, but the Shining Path had an incredible presence in this public university in Lima, and this was a state of the buildings, and learn from President Gonzalo, down with revisionism, that's the left, death to soplones, stool pigeons. This is one of the justifications for killing people is you were soplon, you had given information away, and this was used very broadly. Anyone could be a soplon, it seemed. The Peruvian Party, long live Maoism, etc. And today it's shocking because San Marcos has rebuilt, painted, quite modern, and for many, if I showed this at San Marcos, some people would hide their eyes, and now, signs of time, students who were there 18, they were born well after Guzman was captured. So again, it's a very, very different universe. One sort of side, perhaps in my mind, the most, unfortunately, the top's cutting out. Shining Path went in brutally in certain areas of the central Amazon jungle and abducted, I used to say thousands, the Truth Commission now is saying it might be tens of thousands of Shipibo or Ashaninka. Ashaninka is probably the better term to use, indigenous people. These are people who are hunter and gatherers, much more mobile. They're considered tribes. Anthropologists would, they're Amazonian, forced to fight for the Shining Path. Just the most brutal part of the final report of the Truth Commission is about them. Caught between them. The military at first didn't understand this, went after them brutally, disrupted, and they are still paying for the consequences of this. Many lawyers for the Truth Commission think that some of the Shining Path is a legal question that I can't answer, but should have been tried for this crimes against humanity, for this, again, these people that have confronted the Incas, they took on the Spanish state, they have never been dominated by the West, and the Shining Path with just sheer brutality forced them to fight. And there were some cases where probably it wasn't coercion, but overwhelmingly the word abduction is used for this. A couple more pictures is all. This is Maria Elena Moyano, who's the 25th anniversary of her death was a couple months ago. She's Afro-Peruvian, which often is not represented enough. It's somewhat of a hidden population in a poor area. I don't even want to call it a shanty town, but poor areas of south of Lima, very politicized. She was a community leader who was anti-Shining Path, threatened, left, came back, and then ultimately shot before she was dynamited in front of her children because of her vociferous protest against Shining Path. She's the case when people say, yeah, but when people say, weren't they looking for a social revolution? But to kill someone like Moyano is just, for me, it was a very important symbolic moment. And since then, the Shining Path have actually debated this. Most still say it was part of it. She's a revisionist. She had sold out. Now there's claims she was getting money from the CIA. It's clearly untrue. She was desperately poor. And then there's some that are saying we might have exceeded on there. But this is one of the most symbolic deaths of this. And a couple more pictures. This is one of my favorites just because of the absurdity. So as you can imagine, when I talk about the violence in the Andean communities, one alternative, the most common, was to come to Lima or come to Huancayo and to move to the cities. People in Lima only talk about Lima, but all the cities had these massive displaced populations. And they moved towards Huaycan, and I mean, as a friend of mine, I showed him this picture, and he said, that's what it looks like in color. I mean, it's this gray area. It works better in Spanish, the joke. Anyway. It's very good East anyway. And you have this picture. Here's the Peruvian military out teaching them the symbols of the patria. And it's just, and half the kids aren't looking. The photographer is clearly more interested. And how they did it is they would then give free haircuts and supposedly notebooks. So it's hearts and minds. It's very feeble efforts by the Peruvian military, which I can talk more about. They're not very present in this talk. They probably should be more, to make sure the Shining Path didn't come in these areas and to win over these people. These are two final, very symbolic pictures. This is a man filling out the form looking for his son who had been kidnapped by the Shining Path, and that's the sala detenido. That's the local jail, if you will, in an Andean town. I know a bit more about him, and it's not. And then this is the Yuyanapac's very symbolic picture of a woman looking for a husband who we now know was killed by the military. And this very the importance of Peru in these small pictures, even these incredibly poor households, you would have these for ID reasons. It's something Jose Ragas here has worked on about the importance of having a photo ID as part of you had to have this to get an ID for Peru. And so for many families, they wouldn't have the albums a more bourgeois family would have. They would have the one, and you got case of women going in, have you seen my son? And see my sons. It's a very, I strongly recommend if you go to Peru, the National Museum has this. It's also online, they're working on it. So let me shift now to my preliminary arguments about violence, and then I'm certainly happy to open it up for questions and comments. And this is based on, as I said, several research trips. I mean, it's a long interest of mine. I lived in Peru, happened to live in Peru many of the years, the majority from 80 to 1992. I lived in Peru about 7 years. So this project has always been sort of circling me is the way I say it, but I've now gone down and trying to deeply read the testimonies. I have much work to do, so again, I want to stress preliminary. One of the first points, I've already made this, but I want to reiterate this, is just the shocking omission that when the Truth Commission started, they were working with 30,000 dead, and it was 70,000 dead. This is still a controversial figure. There are conservative politicians. There are some members of the military, not all. The military actually has some very people interested in dialogue and such. This is based on a calculation. They don't have 70,000 names, but it's based on a calculation on if this massacre took this place, we know there were some children who were unnamed, etc. Most specialists would say that number is probably higher. It was 69,600 or whatever. It's probably higher than that. The Shining Path did not ever bury their victims. They would often throw them over cliffs. The Shining Path, if their own members were killed, made it back to camp, they would hide their bodies to not give the military the knowledge of this. So we think the number's higher. The Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission begins their report about, and again, nothing more boring than someone reading a quote, but the double scandal, the number of dead, assassinations, disappearance, and mass torture, and on the other, the apathy, ineptitude, and indifference of those who could have stopped this human catastrophe but did not. And here, what you get in the Truth Commission is very strong on this, and I'm a believer in the Truth Commission. I'm a defender. It's now there's criticism, and it should be debated and criticized from the left, from the right, why it didn't take ethnicity. I've heard this a lot about ethnicity more. What they showed is that 3/4 of the victims had indigenous languages, were indigenous as their first tongue, which is a sign of, in a country where people who are of Quechua descent, if you move to the city and you speak Spanish, you're no longer indigenous. It's a country manages a very narrow definition of indigeneity. The mass majority of the victims were indigenous, okay? And so this clearly has to do with the omission, the apathy, ineptitude, because if this were happening in Lima, there would have been much, much, much greater attention, preoccupation, etc. Instead, and this is, I think, almost uniformly agreed, there might be some members of the far right who would disagree, would say it was because, it was those indigenous people. It was far away from us. A massacre in Lucanamarca, I don't even know where that is in the name. All of the names are Quispe. They are indigenous names. There was less concern that if it had been the powers that be. And here the contrast with the Southern Cone are great. Southern Cone victims are urban. It was very hard to hide. Here, it was also hard to do journalism. Both the Shining Path and the military had no patience with human rights workers, journalists, and there were many journalists shot. So getting data was hard, getting information, but there were also many groups who went in denial, postponed it, etc. And the curious thing about the Peruvian Truth Commission is, I argue in a separate paper, and it's linked to this, there's a paradox. They did their job so well, everyone hates it. Because what they did is, you're all guilty. They didn't just say, it's the terrible military coup, and we can all feel good. It said, of course, it's the military who committed 40-some%. Shining Path was guilty for 54%. I should have given these numbers earlier. So this is an absolute contrast with Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, shifting Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, where it's all over at least 93% of the people killed by the state, generally US funded. Shining Path was guilty of 54% of those 70,000 dead, okay? So a great contrast. But the Truth Commission laid blame very widely for the Catholic Church for silencing it, for the left for being very slow to criticize Shining Path, although then the left was victimized by, all sectors and all parties were guilty for this complicity or silence about this. And this is why I think there's a sort of lack of a base for the Truth Commission. It doesn't exist anymore, and now everyone is sort of taking pot shots at it. I actually think if you read it, it's on one of the brilliant things they did, knowing that Peruvians' bookstores don't extend through the country. What is amazing in Peru is internet access. They put it out online. So you can buy, and there's a Spanish version, there's an English version online, Hatun Wiyakui, which I strongly recommend. There's a Quechua version of Hatun Wiyakui, and all of this is online and read very broadly. It's one of the great things they did. But in general, certainly conservatives don't like it, the military doesn't like it, the Shining Path doesn't like it, and it's criticized without having been read. Oh, it's too pro-senderista, they don't understand the glories of the military. And it also gave an amazing amount of data and information, the stuff that I'm mining now, and many of us are, and there's some very good research going on. So let me get to some of my points. First of all, when you talk about Shining Path, I start with ideology. It's just a very unique movement, destruction, justification of violence. They had a thing called the quota, that you had to be willing to let your blood flow and you had to be willing to kill. Part of this is classic military ideology. If you join an armed force, it would be the military, guerrilla movement, paramilitary, the best soldier is one willing to kill. I mean, you don't need to study military history for this. But there was this justification of all uses of violence. And I think one thing that I'm struggling with right now is the ideology was also very reducible. It was very malleable because it could be, if you read Guzman's writings, and they were out, again, these very arcane leftist debates about semi-feudalism, the modes of production, the Albanian way, Mao's Long March. I can barely follow this stuff. But for his indigenous followers, there was a sort of reduced discourse of, you are exploited, the system can't be fixed, it's got to be destroyed, and we will create a new utopia. And when I write things like this, I want to say it's borderline racism. I'm not saying they made it simple for the dumb Indians, and I know, and I've debated this with people. Instead, I think all political messages have to be reducible. I mean, again, Obama became hope. Trump, I can't say without laughing, make America great again. I said it without laughing or crying. These sort of things. So I worry about this. But again, it was very, when you read the interviews with like Quechua or people bilingual, not very good Spanish, it would be, the system is bad. There's a classic interview that was on the Americas program about a senderista in jail saying, look, if your shoe is broken, do you keep rebuilding it? No, you've got to tear apart and get a new one. There's this sort of simple ideology, if you will. And the problem with this is also, it's not only this borderline oversimplification, borderline racism. We could stop there, and there's a very simple sort of journalism, and it's crazy. It's very easily exoticized. You've got this nutty philosophy professor, because Guzman is crazy and he's fascinating and horrifying, but he got this philosophy. He believes that he is this new Messiah, led by these loyal indigenous people. It's a series of stereotypes. So I think what we really need to do now is understand Maoism, look at the ideology, but what a great theorist of violence, of political science, Stathis Kalivas, who's written one of my favorite books in Civil War in Greece, is the how question. How was it fought? What happened over time? Why were people recruited? Why did the violence take on such incredible numbers? And these are the kind of things the next 5 or 10 minutes. I'm okay, right? 5 or 10? I'm going to look at. Timing is very important. And this is something that I think Peruvian scholars, because they live this, it's contemporary history. And again, it's a question that I often get. How is it doing contemporary history as someone who's always worked with it's very different. And again, people are alive. I work on stepping toes, or what do you report, what do you not? But many Peruvians live this, and they forget how the flux of time and how things change. I sort of talk, about 3 periods, if you will. The initial bloodbath, the Shining Path, having the surprise advantage. They stepped in this void, recent democracy, spread like crazy, executed authorities, ransacked mines, pushed out NGOs, got rid of priests and nuns who were out in the countryside, killing some nuns in the meantime, really created a vacuum of power, if you will. 2 years later, the military steps in, and you get, with horribly brutal military methods of reaction. This is 82, 83, 84. And then you get the long stalemate in which civilians are the victims. This is 84 until 92. And this is something very common in civil war. The data, I was just reading a very data-driven study on violent civil war, and that these sort of irregular conflicts tend to be the bloodiest ones because in the end, you're fighting about civilians. And so the Shining Path is doing these things I keep mentioning, killing local authorities. They're killing, they're killing estate owners, they're killing some terrible exploiters, but they're killing local mayors, union leaders, et cetera, et cetera. They're killing people in universities who are speaking out against them. The military is also disappearing people. They are abusing in horrific ways the prisoners and such. And each side is, if you will, victimizing civilian population in the countryside, but also rural. And in the general context is official indolence or just not paying much attention. Let me give you 2 slides. This is from the Peruvian Truth Commission. This is stolen from, it's downloadable from their report, which is online. This is the number of deaths and disappearance, and this is roughly what I was talking about. This is the Shining Path vacuum, creates this vacuum. The military comes in, numbers go down, and then we get another as the battles by 89 and 90 go national. The other way to look at this, and it's a lot of information on that, this is where were the deaths and disappearance coming from. This would be Ayacucho. So it was almost all at first, and then northeastern region, and that's a lot of the drug area. And that's where horrific forms of violence, it collided with the drug war, if you will, and Ayacucho had a lower percentage. Central region were the Andes, and then Lima has a certain percentage. So again, to really understand this, I think we need to push and look a lot at both space and time, how it changed over time, how the different regions varied. One reflection is what I found is a declining discipline of the Shining Path. The general belief, if you hated the Shining Path, if you had a quiet respect for them, you said they are disciplinados, they are disciplined. They'll hike over mountains, they don't care about hunger, they get shot in the ankle and they wrap it up and keep fighting. There was always this incredible respect for their selflessness and their courage. And again, those are words, if I said in Peru, I'd get people, I'm not complimenting them, this is a reaction to them about the seeming courage and selflessness. And what we're seeing now, that what I found, and again, I still preliminary, is you're getting more and more or less discipline among Shining Path. One way I found this is by 1985, 86, 87, the number of cases where Shining Path members are accused of stealing, raping, doing things that the party didn't allow increases. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that the initial core group, we're talking about hundreds, low thousands in Ayacucho. They had been trained, monitored, they had been literally training for guerrilla war, they had read their Maoism, they were trained that their blood didn't matter, that they should never worry about their own pain, that Maoism would make the pain go away. They have these incredible aphorisms about these things. They were told that one woman, one testimony broke my heart about how when she handed over a child who she never saw again, said, those are petty bourgeois sentimentalism. Well, don't believe that one. So you initially, what I'm trying to say is you have this very disciplined core fighters that over the years you can't replicate. They're lost, either they're killed, they're jailed, or you need more, and as you expand out, you can't find these incredibly disciplined people, and you get less discipline within the Shining Path. And so one of the big arguments I'm making, and again, this is not completely original, this is in a dialogue with a lot of other people, but I do think we're seeing a rupture of the Shining Path mystique. Because if you got people together to talk about Shining Path, when I was saying the late 80s, or early 90s, when my daughter was born in Lima, I remember, we renting a house with an elevator or an apartment, because there were blackouts. It's like every other day, and you learn, oh my God, literally, if you got in the elevator, you made sure you'd been to the bathroom. I won't go any farther with that one. With blackouts, things like that. But there was this notion that these SOBs from Lima, these, no respect except for they're good. They could win. They controlled the jails. This is another example I didn't throw in there. They had Peruvian jails have always been despicable, just gross, horrifically violent. They're built for 400 people and they house 7,000 where, just massive amounts of abuse. You had the Shining Path areas, spick and span clean, people marching with banners with Guzman, singing songs. There's a very famous BBC images from Channel 4 from 1991, I believe. People said, I remember with Peruvians saying, if the state can't control inside a jail, how the hell is it going to control the rest of the country? I mean, there was this notion that they could win. And this part of it is selfless, disciplined robots. And this built on some Andean stereotypes about indigenous people following orders, being harder working than people on the coast who would like to enjoy a beer and eat better, were indigenous people, and women were robotics. You have these stereotypes built on a great deal of sexism and a certain amount of racism as well. And what you get in the testimonies is this incredible, by reading them is, first of all, you hear their stories, these people who joined the Shining Path, not because they were firm believers. As you got away from Ayacucho, it was many women running away from very difficult family scenes. One woman I'm writing about was being groped and being probably molested by an uncle. She was 13, she went up and she ended up joining the Shining Path. So they certainly aren't selfless and each has their own personal story. But you're getting, as you read these stories, they often had to steal food to eat. That's never in the Shining Path. Their official history, they were always given food by comrades. If they weren't given it, they would buy it. If they couldn't, they would starving, et cetera, et cetera. You're getting this notion of they were much more human than we think and probably less efficient. And on the other hand, the notion of the leadership is cohesive. They're fair. There might be SOBs, but they're fair and their treatment has been blown up by a book I strongly recommend. It's in English. Lorgio Gavilan Sanchez, When Rains Became Floods, is a testimony of a boy who, when Quechua speaker, monolingual, indigenous boy, went looking for his brother in the Shining Path, joined the Shining Path, was captured by the military, literally about to be executed, when they felt so sorry for him because he had so much lice and his ribs were showing. They brought him in as a pet. They really called him mascota. And he showed his abilities. He was actually going to go become an officer. He then went and became, I'm not making this up, a Franciscan priest. And now he's become an anthropologist. So it's indigenous boy, guerrilla fighter, soldier, Franciscan, and now an anthropologist. And his testimony is amazing. Controversial in its own ways. Many people says he uses passive voice. He never admits he killed people and things like that. But when you read it, it completely disrupts this myth of the Shining Path leadership. There were men moving. There were lots of people you could be executed. He said one of his favorite friends was executed. I don't remember. Now I'm not remembering the story well because he had fallen asleep at sentinel duty. There were people asking battalions to move around, trying to get the pretty women in their columns so they could do what they want with the women. This notion of discipline, no sort of harassment, somewhat egalitarian blows up with his testimony, and everything I've read agrees with this. It was a much less cohesive, egalitarian, and even efficient structure than we know. And this, I think, is the big step back that we really need to think about this to understand the complexities of, who fought for them and why. My final point, because I think I'm okay with time, but I will stop here. Why were they defeated? You can talk forever about who supported the Shining Path. One thing that we will never have a clear, I don't think, models of saying towns that are higher tended to be more pro Shining Path than lower, because towns changed, individuals changed over time, but towns did as well. And to use the much used term gray area, it was all gray areas. I mean, there was a little black here and there's a little white here, but most was gray. People changing, people forced to support Shining Path, people forced to support the military, abductions, etc. So I think that the sociological analysis of who were they, why did they kill, is going to take lots and lots of local ethnographies with people who speak Quechua, but also broader studies. The final point I want to make, though, is why were they defeated? It was the opposition of civil society. Here we got, I don't want to do this and just say, oh, we have to worry about the Shining Path, the military. It was the ronderos, the peasant patrols, very controversial topic, but peasants organized. They would fight back Shining Path. They paid for this in gruesome ways. The Shining Path went after them with unbelievable brutality. I mean, we're not talking about executions, we're talking about all sorts of abuses. We're also talking about groups, grassroots organizations, human rights groups, and the multitudes. And here I should include much of Peru. And as I said, the CVR, the Peruvian Truth Commission, blamed so much of Peru. Everyone has some guilt for not doing enough, for overlooking or saying, oh, who cares, it's indigenous people, or just being quiet about it. At the same time, this positive story of how this group was defeated were by this very broad cast of characters. So I just want to end with that to bring that up. So anyway, I've covered a lot of ground. I hope we have some questions, comments, criticism, etc. And again, I'm here to learn from you, so thank you for listening.